The diner smelled of old coffee and hot oil, the kind that settled into the walls and never left. Yellow fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flattening everything beneath them, faces, plates, even time. He sat alone in a corner booth. A tailored dark suit framed his posture, clean and intentional. His jacket lay folded beside him, sharp creases intact. At his feet rested a leather briefcase, worn but expensive, the kind meant for offices with doors that closed softly. On the table sat a thick folder, its edges frayed from use, a gold-embossed seal half hidden beneath a napkin. Steam curled from his mug as he lifted it slowly. Controlled, deliberate, the ceramic touched the table without a sound. The bell above the door rang, boots followed, heavy, certain. Conversation didn't stop, but it thinned, stretched tight. A uniformed cop stepped inside, scanning the diner like a checklist. Counter, cash register, booths. Then he paused. His eyes settled on the black man. The man felt it before he looked up. "Evening," the cop said, already too close. "Evening," the man replied, voice steady. The cop tilted his head. "We got a call," he said. "Someone suspicious hanging around this area." The word stayed in the air longer than it should have. The man glanced around, families finishing meals, a couple sharing pie, a trucker staring into his coffee, then back to the officer. "I'm having dinner." The cop's gaze dropped not to the plate but to the suit, to the briefcase, to the folder. "Stand up." A pause, small, heavy. "Is there a reason?" the man asked. The cop's hand hovered near his belt. "Hands where I can see them." They already were, flat on the table, still. A chair scraped behind him. The waitress froze mid-step. "I'm not a threat," the man said. The cop grabbed him anyway. Coffee spilled, dark and sudden. A plate slid off the table and shattered, the crack snapping every head in the diner toward them. As the man was yanked up, the briefcase tipped over. Papers spilled out, official, stamped, orderly, landing on the floor. The cop's boot came down on them without hesitation. Pressed, ground, ignored. "Don't resist," the cop said loudly for the room. "I'm not resisting," the man replied as cold metal snapped around his wrists, biting too tight. The cop leaned in, close enough for only him to hear. His eyes moved once more, over the suit, over the skin inside it. "You don't belong in this suit," he whispered. A woman near the counter murmured. He didn't do anything. The cop shoved the man against the booth. Vinyl groaned. Papers crumpled under his boot. As he was dragged toward the door, the man spoke once, quiet, measured. "Officer," he said, "you're standing on the law." The bell rang. No one followed, and no one stopped it. By the time the cop's cruiser disappeared down the street, the diner had already returned to itself. Plates were replaced. Coffee was refilled. Someone laughed too loudly at the counter, the sound brittle, like it didn't quite belong. The bell above the door had stopped swaying. What had happened was already being folded into the long list of things people didn't talk about. Inside the back seat of the cruiser, the man sat upright. The vinyl stuck slightly to his palms. His wrists ached where the cuffs bit in, metal cold against skin, just tight enough to remind him they were there. He adjusted his breathing the way he had learned to do years ago, slow in through the nose, slower out through the mouth. Panic wasted energy. Anger made mistakes. Streetlights passed in rhythm through the narrow window, painting his face in brief flashes of yellow and shadow. This wasn't new, that was the thought that bothered him most. He had been stopped before, questioned, watched. The settings changed, airports, parking lots, hotel lobbies, but the posture was always the same, the pause before the question. The eyes that lingered too long, the assumption that he needed to explain himself. He remembered being 23, freshly graduated, standing outside a courthouse with a stack of books under his arm when a patrol car slowed beside him. "Who you here to see?" the officer had asked. "Myself," he'd said then, too proud to soften it. The officer hadn't liked that answer. Tonight felt like a continuation of that same unfinished conversation, stretched over decades. The cruiser slowed at a red light. He caught his reflection in the plexiglass divider, suit rumpled now, collar slightly bent where the cop had grabbed him. He thought about the way the officer's eyes had moved, not confused, not curious. Measuring as if the suit itself had been the offense. He had earned that suit. Every stitch carried hours, late nights bent over case law, early mornings listening more than speaking, years of learning how to be precise when others were allowed to be loud. He'd learned quickly that brilliance alone was never enough. He had to be unimpeachable, calm, predictable, better than expected, better than forgiven. At home, his closet was organized like a discipline. Shirts pressed, shoes polished, nothing left to chance. Appearances mattered when the margin for error was thin. Still, none of it traveled with him in moments like this. The radio crackled from the front seat. Routine codes, familiar boredom. The cop didn't look back. The man shifted his wrist slightly, easing the pressure. The metal scraped softly. He stopped. Small sounds could be misread. Outside, the town blurred by closed storefronts, a church with its lights still on, a billboard promising easy loans. He wondered who had made the call. Someone who saw him through the window of the diner and felt unsettled by a presence they couldn't categorize. Someone who reached for the word suspicious because it was available, because it was safe, because it didn't require explanation. He'd spent years inside institutions that claimed neutrality. He knew better than most how bias hid behind procedure, how tone became justification, how discretion became cover. The cruiser turned into the station lot. As the car rolled to a stop, his thoughts drifted, not to fear but to routine. He mentally inventoried what would come next. The questions, the paperwork, the wait. He had seen this from the other side often enough to know the choreography. Still, knowing didn't blunt the weight of it. Inside the station, fluorescent lights hummed with a sharper edge than the diners. The air smelled of disinfectant and old carpet. Voices echoed down the hall, detached, efficient. The cop opened the door. Out. The man stepped carefully, adjusting his balance. The cuffs tugged. He steadied himself without comment. As they walked, a few officers glanced up. Some barely looked at him. Others looked longer, curious in that way that wasn't curiosity at all. He felt the familiar narrowing of space around him, as if the building itself had decided where he fit. A desk officer glanced at the paperwork, then at him. Her eyes flicked briefly to the suit, the scuffed shoes, the calm posture that didn't match the story she expected. She said nothing. He was guided to a bench. Sit. He did. Time stretched. Minutes pooled. He listened to the sounds of the station, the buzz of printers, a phone ringing unanswered, laughter from somewhere down the hall. The world continued with no regard for the fact that he was now reduced to a file number waiting to be assigned. His mind drifted again, unbidden to his father. A tall man with quiet hands and a habit of straightening his tie before entering any building, no matter how small. His father had taught him early that dignity was armor, but also a burden. That you could do everything right and still be treated as if you hadn't. Never give them a reason, his father used to say. What he hadn't said, but what his son had learned, was that sometimes reason didn't matter. Across the room, an officer joked about paperwork. Another complained about a long shift. Normalcy pressed in from all sides, indifferent and complete. The man flexed his fingers slightly, feeling the circulation return in small, stinging waves. He thought about the papers now crumpled on the diner floor, the seal bent under a stranger's boot. The irony was sharp enough to make him almost smile. Almost. A supervisor passed by, slowed, glanced at him again. There was a flicker there, recognition, maybe, or something close to it, but it passed. The supervisor kept walking. He wondered how long it would take, whether the system would notice him, or whether he would remain invisible long enough for things to go further than they should. He weighed once more the choice he had been postponing all night, to speak, to name himself. He had always believed that authority should be revealed only when necessary. That respect extracted by title was brittle. He preferred the slower work of example, of consistency. But sitting there now, wrists aching, suit wrinkled, he understood the risk of silence, too. Silence protected no one when the assumptions were already made. The bench was cold beneath him. The cuffs were still tight. Around him, the machinery of order continued to hum, smooth and unquestioned. And somewhere between the diner and this bench, a simple truth settled in his chest with quiet clarity. Tonight wasn't about what he had done. It was about who they had decided he was the moment they saw him. He lifted his gaze, steady and patient, and waited for the moment when the story would have to change. The desk officer didn't look up when she spoke. Full name. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, already impatient. The man sat straight on the bench, shoulders squared despite the cuffs. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he inclined his head slightly toward the plastic bin on the counter. "My identification is in there," he said calmly. "You'll find it faster than typing." The desk officer paused. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't attitude. It was instruction. She glanced up now, really looked at him for the first time. The suit, the posture, the absence of anxiety. Then she reached into the bin and pulled out the wallet. She opened it. Her fingers slowed. The arresting cop, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, noticed the shift. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, eyes still on the card. She slid the ID under the scanner. The system chirped softly, then chirped again. The desk officer's posture changed. Spine straighter, shoulders back. She clicked once more, brows knitting as more information populated the screen than usual. The cop pushed off the wall. "What's taking so long?" The man watched all of this without moving. without speaking. His silence wasn't empty, it was deliberate, the way a judge lets a witness talk themselves into a corner. The desk officer cleared her throat. "I'm going to get the supervisor." She stood quickly and disappeared down the hall, ID still in her hand. The cop's jaw tightened. He turned to the man. "You got something you want to explain?" The man met his eyes, calm, level. "I'm explaining plenty by not interrupting you," the cop scoffed. "You think wearing a suit makes you untouchable?" "No," the man said. "I think it made you uncomfortable." That landed. The cop stepped closer. "Guys like you put on nice clothes, start thinking you're above the law." The man tilted his head slightly. "No, guys like me spend years learning how the law is used." The cop laughed once sharp. "You're all the same, performative. Trying to look important. Important enough," the man replied evenly, "for you to invent suspicion." Footsteps approached. The supervisor emerged from the hallway, ID in hand. He didn't speak right away. He stopped. Looked at the screen behind the desk, then at the ID, then at the man. He didn't look again. He didn't need to. Color drained from his face in a way training couldn't hide. The room shifted. Background noise softened. A nearby officer stopped mid-sentence. Even the printer seemed to hesitate before spitting out its page. The supervisor handed the ID back to the desk officer slowly, as if the plastic weighed more than it should. "Remove the cuffs," he said. The cop blinked. "Sir." Now, keys rattled. Metal released. The cuffs dropped with a dull sound that felt louder than the diner plate breaking earlier that night. The man rolled his wrists once, testing circulation. He did not thank anyone. The supervisor straightened. "Sir, there appears to have been a misunderstanding." The man stood, adjusted his jacket, smoothed the sleeve where it had been yanked. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. "Let's define that." The supervisor swallowed. "Officer," he said, turning sharply to the cop, "what was the probable cause?" The cop hesitated. "We had a call." "A call," the man said, stepping closer now, not aggressive but present. "From whom?" "That's confidential. Not in an official inquiry," the man replied. The supervisor's eyes flicked back to him, a flash of realization. "Sir, you reviewed my ID," the man said. "So you already know I don't speak casually." The supervisor nodded once. "Yes, sir." The man gestured lightly toward the cop. "This officer accused me of being suspicious while seated, compliant, and silent." He escalated to physical restraint inside a public diner. He stepped on legal documents. The cop bristled. "I was maintaining control." "Control," the man said quietly, "is not the same as authority." The supervisor raised a hand. "Officer, step back." The cop did reluctantly. The man continued, voice measured but surgical. "I will be filing an official judicial inquiry by morning. That includes your arrest protocol, your discretionary thresholds, and every prior complaint associated with this badge number." The supervisor inhaled sharply. "Sir, perhaps we can handle this internally." "No," the man said, not loud, not angry. "You cannot." He stepped closer to the desk, eyes never leaving the supervisor. "Internal handling is how patterns survive." The room was silent now. "You will preserve all reports, dispatch logs, and call records related to this incident," the man continued. "You will notify your legal department before sunrise. And you will ensure this officer does not file an amended narrative." The cop snapped. "You can't just come in here," and the supervisor cut him off. "Enough," the man turned to the cop. "You said I didn't belong in my suit." The cop looked away. "You believed the suit was a disguise," the man went on. "Something borrowed, something deceptive." He leaned in slightly, not to intimidate, but to be heard. "What unsettled you was not my presence. It was the possibility that I belonged exactly where I was." The cop's mouth tightened. The man straightened. "If I had been white, this would have been a courtesy check at most." No one contradicted him. The supervisor spoke carefully. "Sir, may I ask how you wish to proceed?" The man considered him for a moment. Then he reached down, picked up his briefcase, and opened it. Inside were the same papers that had been on the diner floor, creased now, but legible. He removed one document and placed it on the counter, a court letterhead, a seal unmistakable even at a distance. The supervisor went still. "This is not personal," the man said. "It is procedural." He closed the briefcase. "And procedures have consequences." He turned toward the exit. As he walked away, no one stopped him. Because now, finally, they understood, this was never about arresting the wrong man. It was about arresting the wrong system. The station didn't return to normal after he left. It tried to, but something had shifted, like a building settling after a quiet quake. Conversations resumed in half voices. Chairs moved more carefully. Even the air felt thinner, as if the certainty that usually filled the room had leaked out through an unseen crack. The supervisor stood where the man had left him, staring at the closed door. No one spoke to the arresting officer. That silence, deliberate, collective, unsettled him more than shouting ever could. He paced once, then stopped, adjusted his belt, rolled his shoulders as if shaking off stiffness, but the tension stayed. The confidence he'd carried into the diner hadn't followed him back inside the station. It had been replaced by something sharp and exposed. Exposure. "Back to work," the supervisor said finally, his voice even but tight. Everyone. The room obeyed, but the rhythm was off. Keys clacked too loudly. A radio squawked and was silenced too fast. The desk officer kept glancing at the screen where the man's information had appeared, now closed, as if the system itself might reopen it on its own. The arresting officer leaned toward her. "You didn't have to scan it twice." She didn't look at him. "The system did that." He scoffed, but the sound lacked weight. "You could have flagged me." She met his eyes then, calm, unblinking. "I didn't have to." He straightened and walked away, boots heavier than before. Outside, the night had cooled. The man stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in air that felt earned now. His wrist still throbbed faintly, a dull reminder of pressure that hadn't been necessary. He flexed his fingers once, then slipped his hands into his coat pockets. Across the street, a patrol car idled. The officer inside stared straight ahead. That too was new. He walked to his car slowly, not from fatigue, from calculation. By the time he reached the driver's seat, the incident had already begun reorganizing itself in his mind, translating into legal language, into precedent and pattern. He didn't replay the shove or the whisper or the boot grinding down on the documents. He cataloged decisions, points of escalation, missed off-ramps, failures. He drove home in silence. Inside the station, the supervisor closed his office door and sat heavily at his desk. He pulled up the incident report and read the first line twice. "Suspicious individual observed in public establishment." He exhaled slowly, then reached for the phone. Across town, the diner manager stood behind the counter, staring at the cracked tile where the plate had shattered earlier. She hadn't cleaned it yet. The mess felt important. A waitress approached, nervous. "Should we mop that?" "Not yet," the manager said. "What if the cop comes back?" "He won't," she replied, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. At a corner table, a man scrolled through his phone. The video shook slightly. The angle was bad, the sound worse, but the moment was unmistakable. The shove, the raised voice, the way the room went still. His thumb hovered, then he tapped upload. Back at the station, the arresting officer sat alone in the locker room, staring at his reflection in the dull metal door. He replayed the night the way he always did, searching for justification. He'd followed procedure. He'd asserted control. The man had challenged him. That mattered, didn't it? The suit had irritated him more than he wanted to admit. The calm, the absence of fear. It had felt like provocation, like mockery. Then the realization crept in, cold and precise. Not who he'd stopped, what he'd stopped. The words he'd whispered, "You don't belong in this suit," echoed back, sour now. Not because they were wrong, because they'd been spoken to the wrong person. A knock sounded on the doorframe. "Internal Affairs has been notified," the supervisor said, flat and controlled. "They'll want statements by morning." The officer stiffened. "Already?" "Yes." "For what?" he snapped. Nothing happened. The supervisor held his gaze. Something did. He turned and left. The officer sat back down hard, the bench creaking under his weight. His fear wasn't about consequences. It was about recognition, about how close he'd come to being untouchable, and how suddenly that illusion had cracked. At home, the man placed his briefcase on the dining table and opened it. He smoothed the crumpled documents carefully, aligning corners, pressing out creases. His movements were methodical, almost ceremonial. His phone buzzed. A message from a colleague, heard about tonight. "Are you all right?" He stared at the screen, then typed, "I'm fine." The system isn't. He set the phone down and walked to the window. The city glowed softly, unaware of the pressure shifting beneath its surface. By morning, questions would begin. Why was a judge detained? Who made the call? Why did procedure fail so cleanly? He knew the answers would arrive slowly. Resistance would follow. Narratives would be rewritten, softened, sanitized. But something irreversible had already occurred. Too many people had seen, too many systems had logged, too many assumptions had collided with reality. Back at the diner, the manager finally swept up the broken plate. She paused, then placed the shards into a small plastic bag instead of the trash. Evidence comes in many forms. Sometimes it's just ceramic shards in a plastic bag. In the station, a printer whirred to life, producing a copy of the report. The desk officer glanced at it, then quietly slid it into a separate folder. Across the city, phones buzzed. The video spread, cropped, reposted, dissected. Not outrage yet, recognition. And somewhere between the silence, the paperwork, and the waiting, a truth settled in. If he hadn't been a judge, this would have ended differently. No supervisor's call, no quiet files, no careful corrections. Just a cell, just another name. And for the first time since the cuffs clicked shut in that diner, the man allowed himself one private certainty. This wouldn't be buried, not this time. The revelation didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and toner ink, where truth usually showed up late, if it showed up at all. Interview room 3. The man sat alone at the metal table, hands resting flat, cuffs still on. Not because they needed to be, but because no one had yet decided they didn't. His jacket lay folded beside him, careful, deliberate. The kind of fold you learn when order matters. The camera in the corner blinked red. Recording. Outside the room, the station moved the way it always did, boots on tile, radios murmuring, laughter that didn't belong to anything important. A normal night doing normal damage. At the front desk, the supervisor stared at the screen. He hadn't meant to run the name himself. That was the desk officer's job. But something had felt off. Not fear, not doubt, delay. The kind of delay that makes a man check his mirrors twice. The database loaded slowly, then stopped, then refreshed. And there it was, not flagged in red, not wrapped in warnings, just official, verified, immutable. The supervisor leaned back in his chair, the air leaving his lungs without permission. No, he muttered. He leaned forward again, ran it twice, 3 times, same result. Behind him, the desk officer noticed the stillness. The absence of sound where there should have been keys clacking and printers humming. "Sir?" he asked. The supervisor didn't turn. "You didn't run him fully," the supervisor said quietly. The desk officer stiffened. "I ran what I had." The supervisor finally looked at him. "No," he repeated. "You ran what you assumed." He stood slow and precise, like a man stepping around a landmine that had already gone off. "Print everything," the printer obeyed. Each page felt heavier than paper had any right to be. The title at the top didn't need emphasis. It didn't need explanation. It needed accountability. The supervisor gathered the pages and walked, not fast, not slow, toward interview room 3. As he passed the lockers, the arresting officer straightened. "Too late. You," the supervisor said, stopping. "Yes, sir. Where did you stop him?" "Outside the restaurant." "And why?" The officer hesitated. That fraction of a second was louder than any answer. "Suspicion," he said. The supervisor nodded once. "Stay here." He continued down the hall alone. Inside interview room 3, the man looked up when the door opened. The supervisor entered and closed it behind him. The latch clicked softly. Final, recorded. For a moment, neither spoke. The supervisor placed the papers on the table between them, face up, the seal visible. The man didn't reach for them. He didn't need to, he already knew. The supervisor cleared his throat. "You're free to go." The man studied his face, not the papers. "Now?" he asked. "Yes," the supervisor said. Immediately, the man nodded once. As he stood, the supervisor added, "You could have told us." The man paused. Slowly, he turned back. "I did," he said evenly. "I gave you my identification. I answered your questions. I followed your instructions." "That's not what I meant," the supervisor said. "I know," the man replied. He slipped on his jacket, unhurried. "You meant I could have saved you from yourselves." The supervisor didn't deny it. The man glanced briefly at the camera in the corner, then back at the supervisor. "This room," he said quietly, "has seen many people who couldn't leave." The supervisor felt the words settle not as a threat, but as a record. "And tonight," the man continued, locking eyes with him, "it saw one who will make sure it changes." Silence, not awkward, judicial. The supervisor stepped aside, opening the door. In the hallway, officers watched without pretending not to. The arresting officer stood near the lockers, hands clenched. His badge caught the light, suddenly too bright. He reached up, fingers brushing it, then stopped. His hand trembled, just enough. The man walked past him, didn't slow, didn't speak, didn't need to. Later, minutes later, not hours, the cuffs were removed. Paperwork followed. Apologies did not. Only procedure, only containment. The supervisor personally watched him exit the station. The door closed behind him with a soft hydraulic sigh. Outside, the night waited, unaware, unchanged. And that was the most dangerous part. Because the revelation wasn't about who he was. It was about who wouldn't have been allowed to leave if he weren't. And that understanding, quiet, clinical, undeniable, was what followed him home. Morning arrived without ceremony. No breaking news banner, no urgent calls, no sudden absolution. just thin winter light sliding through half-open blinds, settling on a dining table still cluttered with yesterday's mail. He stood at the counter, coffee cooling untouched in his hand. The briefcase sat nearby, its leather scuffed along one edge where it had struck the station floor. He hadn't wiped it clean. Some marks weren't damaged, they were record. He opened it. Inside, folders, notes, timestamps, a small recorder, and a thin stack of documents he hadn't planned to review this early. He chose one page and wrote carefully. Time, location, names, exact language. "You don't belong in this suit." He underlined the sentence once, not for emphasis, for accuracy. Across the city, a locker room hummed with artificial normalcy. Laughter rose and fell too quickly. A joke landed wrong and no one bothered to fix it. One officer sat longer than necessary, elbows on his knees, staring at his hands as if they'd acted on their own. His badge rested beside him on the bench, not removed, just heavy. At the station, the supervisor's office door stayed closed past noon. Calls were made, reports opened, language chosen with care, neutral, procedural, defensible. No one said racism, they didn't need to. Back at the table, the phone vibrated. A single message lit the screen. "You okay?" He replied without pause. "I'm fine, the system isn't." He didn't add context. Context was the point. Later that afternoon, the diner reopened. The manager swept ceramic shards from behind the counter. The remains of a plate dropped during the arrest. Customers stepped around the spot where it had shattered, unaware they were avoiding a footprint of the night. The shards went into a plastic bag. The bag hovered over the trash, then stopped. The manager set it aside instead. Evidence came in many forms. Sometimes it was just ceramic in a bag. By evening, a video began moving, not viral. Not loud, shared quietly, forwarded without captions, passed along in group chats with no commentary. Just the clip, just the audio, just the moment where hands already visible were ordered higher. No edits, no music. No outrage packaging, reality unframed. The man watched none of it. Instead, he sat at his desk and drafted a request, not an accusation. An inquiry, official, dull, impossible to ignore. He understood the system. It didn't bend to noise. It yielded to paper. The resolution didn't arrive with spectacle. No officer was marched out in cuffs. No speech echoed on courthouse steps. No victory declared. What changed was quieter. A name added to a file. A pattern documented. A margin for error reduced. Somewhere an officer would hesitate next time, not from understanding, from fear. And that, too, was part of the truth. As night returned, he closed the briefcase and placed it by the door. Tomorrow he'd return to work, to a courtroom where words mattered, where silence carried weight. Before turning off the light, he paused. He thought again of the version of himself without the title, without the system recognizing his name. That man would still be sitting in a cell. No appeal, no inquiry, no quiet corrections happening behind closed doors. That was the resolution, not justice, not closure, just clarity. And the bitter knowledge that, in this system, dignity was still conditional. Weeks passed, but the night didn't fade. The diner remained open, plates stacked and dishes clinking, but the memory lingered in the corners. The manager sometimes paused mid-sweep, looking at the corner where the plate had shattered, thinking of the hands that had been unjustly restrained. The shards, now carefully bagged and labeled, served as a quiet monument to accountability, a reminder that even small evidence mattered. The arresting officer no longer walked with the same ease. His badge felt heavier than leather and metal should. Each time he reached for it, his hand trembled just enough for him to notice, just enough for others to notice if they looked. The system hadn't loudly punished him, but he knew it had noticed, and that awareness changed behavior, quietly, irreversibly. Across town, the man returned to his courtroom. His gavel sounded with authority tempered by restraint. Each decision, each ruling, carried the weight of the night when power had collided with prejudice. He didn't boast. He didn't remind anyone of what could have happened. He simply let the law, careful, exacting, relentless, speak for him. And somewhere in the silent spaces between judgments, the truth settled. Dignity, once threatened, could still be preserved, not by spectacle, not by vengeance, but by patience, by documentation, by letting the system see what it had tried to ignore. Sometimes justice whispers, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it speaks through shards of ceramic, trembling hands, and a name that refused to be erased. Not all who wield power are just, but all who endure deserve dignity.